One reason I really like the devotional style of reading through the Bible is that it affords me what I call the 10,000 foot view. It gives you the big picture. When I read through the entire New Testament last year, the big picture became the key sentence that Jesus uttered when he was asked, what's the greatest commandment of all? And he said, that's easy. Love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Upon these hang all the law and the commandments. In fact, all the epistles that are in the New Testament are merely an expansion of one of those two things. What does loving God look like? What does loving your neighbor look like? In the Old Testament, so far, as I have made it up through 2 Samuel now, the overriding 10,000 foot view for me is that the heart of man is deceitfully wicked above all things. That man, in and of his own very basic nature, is an enemy of God and will disobey God. So how does one get from being an enemy of God to being able to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind in the New Testament? Well, Paul would tell you, you can't. It's impossible. Unless there is an internal change of heart, which can only be accomplished by God's Holy Spirit. Only then can you become someone who has moved from being an enemy of God to becoming a friend of God. That is the overriding view of the entire Bible. Greetings and salutations. Welcome to another fine day in the Lord's neighborhood, and welcome to another episode of Coffee, the Bible and Paige. I'm Paige. Here's my coffee. And everybody said in the beginning, coffee, and lo, it was very good. Today's coffee is a treat. It's espresso mixed with some hot chocolate. Oh, I love it. It's a cold day outside. Cold winter's day, the first really cold winter's day we've had, and this tastes really great. All right, today we're going to be going on in chapter 11, and we're going to read the story of David and Bathsheba. You know, I knew the story. I've known the story. I've heard about it. I've heard sermons preached on it a time and again. But I took a day off from doing these devotionals. I didn't post this yesterday, which I normally would have, because I was really disturbed by what I read. And I did some more research, and I became even more disturbed by what I read. And talk about the heart of man being deceitfully wicked above all things. What we're going to read about David today, it should break your heart. Because generally speaking, when I think about someone whose heart is deceitfully wicked above all things, and like I said in my introduction, that's usually a descriptor of someone who's an enemy of God, who is not in relationship with God. And Jesus bridged that gap with his death and resurrection. He bridged the gap so that man can now move into right relationship with God. And what I see in David, who is proclaimed as a man after God's own heart, is proof of the wickedness of our heart. And it's proof that even if you are a God follower, you can commit the most heinous sins and crimes. This is quite possibly, as far as I'm concerned, the absolute lowest point of David's life, where he displayed the wickedness of his nature, and he allowed that wickedness to prevail. Unlike David in every other situation we read about him, this time he totally, completely fails. himself, his nation, and his God. So let's get started. Like I said, I don't know about you, but I will be somewhat disturbed again as I read through this, I'm sure. But let's get started. Chapter 11. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and they besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. All right, this is where the dun 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 music would start if this were a movie. It's spring, the time when armies can march without being impeded. The rains have passed. There's plenty of fodder for animals, and this is the time you go to war. And normally David would go with this, but he sent his army out with his chief general Joab, and David stays at home. Have you ever heard that saying, idle hands are the devil's workshop? Well, we're about to see that that's indeed the case. He should have been leading his men into battle. Now, was this a law? Was this something that Jewish kings were mandated to do? Now, I'd say no, because he's only the second Jewish king, so there's no mandate what the king should do. But what he should do, what he's supposed to do, sometimes is two different things. He should have been on the battlefield with his men. If he had been on the battlefield with his men, this would not have happened, what we're about to read. And this is probably a great lesson in and of itself, that even if you're a God follower, if you are not actively engaged with doing the right thing, if you're not actively engaged with following after God, pursuing God, idle hands become the devil's workshop. We're about to see that. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Okay, a couple things here. She's Bathsheba. She's the daughter of Eliam. Now, who? Eliam? Again, Jewish names. Please forgive me. And she's the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Now, Eliam was a son of Ahithophel, who was in turn David's counselor. So she was the granddaughter of David's counselor. Her grandfather had David's ear. This is going to come into play down the road, because this grandfather is going to be very upset about what happens to his granddaughter. Now, it says here, she had purified herself from uncleanness. Let's see here. That means her ceremonial uncleanness. We're going to read about that in the next verse, but just know that she was cleansing herself. All right, ceremonial uncleanness. She just had her monthly cycle, menstrual cycle, and she was cleaning. Now, the picture I used to have was of this beautiful woman bathing naked in a very exhibitionist type fashion on the top of the roof of her house. And David happened to look out and see this naked woman taking a bath, and things happened. Not necessarily so. She was purifying herself from her uncleanness. Now, it might have been very stiflingly hot, and so she was on her roof, but that doesn't mean she was naked, cleansing. It could be just she was going through the process of maybe pouring water over herself. She wasn't necessarily taking a full-on bath without her clothes on. There's every possibility that she was fully clothed and she was just on the roof of her house because it was stinking hot inside, and she was cleansing herself. Now, this tells us one thing. First of all, she was clearly not pregnant when she did come to David, because she had just finished having her menstrual cycle. And shortly after coming to David, she becomes pregnant, leaving no doubt that the child is going to be David's. I guess I'm giving you a spoiler alert, right? Now, Eliam. Later on, Eliam being the son of Ahithophel, this would explain Ahithophel's later betrayal of David in favor of Absalom's conspiracy. David has a son, Absalom, who tries to take the kingdom away from his father David. And Ahithophel sides with him. This would make sense because I know, as a grandfather, if someone violated my granddaughter, there would be no end to my fury. I would be incredibly angry. And I would probably be tempted to do something about it. Here's what happened. Absalom's trying to take the kingdom away from David. And in 2 Samuel chapter 16, just a few chapters down the road, it says, Absalom said to Ahithophel, give us your advice. Ahithophel, Bathsheba's grandfather, give us your advice. What should we do? Ahithophel answered, sleep with your father's concubines, whom he left to take care of the palace. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself obnoxious to your father, and the hands of everyone with you will be more resolute. You slept with my granddaughter? Illegally? That's my advice to your son. Go sleep with your father's wives. Basically, that's what concubines were. And go sleep with them and shame him. And you could see parenthetically Ahithophel going, the way you shamed my family by what you did to my granddaughter. Oh, Ahithophel is some kind of upset. Now, there's a couple things here. I read an article from a place called Honor Shame. And the question asked was, did Bathsheba seduce David? Was poor David the victim of a seductive woman? That's the thought. And that's kind of what was presented to me years ago. It wasn't David's fault, really. Yeah, he had a part in it. But, Bathsheba, she was dancing around, taking a bath naked on a rooftop, and, stuff's going to happen. Well, all right. These are the notes from this article, and this opened up my eyes. First of all, Bathsheba was socially prominent. She was the daughter of Eliam. Both her father and her husband were on David's top 30 list of elite warriors. Uriah was a mercenary, a Hittite, and thus would have enjoyed renown and honor. So this isn't some woman unknown to him whom he happens to glance being pretty and bathing naked on a rooftop. No, David knew who she was. David knew who she was. She came from a distinguished family, and she would have been expected to comport herself accordingly. And Bathsheba most likely would have acted to retain her family's social prominence. She's not going to flaunt herself. She wouldn't be expected to. Now, Bathsheba was Torah observant. This is very important. She was not bathing to seduce David, but to observe Old Testament purity regulations. So let's reverse engineer the thing. Let's look backwards. Bathsheba got pregnant, right? So that means she was ovulating at the time she saw David. Ovulation happens a week after menstruation stops. Therefore, Bathsheba was bathing 1 week after her bleeding, precisely what the Jewish law says to do. And the story even says, now she'd been purifying herself from her uncleanness. That detail describes the purposes of Bathsheba's cleansing and alerts astute readers to an impeding problem, as the time of ritual bathing is when babies are made, because she's ovulating. Bathsheba's bath was likely the ritual bathing of a Torah-observant lady and not a Hollywood-style seduction scene. The text does not say she was bathing naked. She may well have been clothed and washing with a bowl. Now this is something else. This is the first thing that really nailed me. She was probably a teenager, late teens. Considering that she was old enough to be married, yet still without children, Bathsheba was likely 16 to 19 years old in this story. In collectivist cultures that prize children, that phase of married without kids usually lasts no more than a year. Nathan's reference to her as a little ewe lamb in 2 Samuel when he confronts David kind of collaborates with this deduction. So she was a young woman, newly married probably to Uriah the Hittite. And why is this disturbing? David's in his mid-30s. He has concubines. He has several wives. And he sees what is probably a young teenager. And odds are she wasn't bathing naked. So what does this mean? What's so seductive about a woman taking water out of a bowl wearing her clothes? Probably nothing. But this gives us an insight. David, please I hope this doesn't offend you. I get the feeling that David planned this. This wasn't an accident. Wandering around, accidentally sees a woman bathing on a rooftop. Oh, I got to go have sexual relations with this woman. I get the feeling that David, since this girl, this Bathsheba, is a granddaughter of his counselor, she grew up, David watching her, David seeing her. She grew up around the court of David. Her grandfather was a counselor. I'm getting a sense that this was this is why this is so disturbing to me. Man in his mid-30s. I get the sense that he was stalking her. Please, I know, I'll probably get comments about you're putting words in the Bible's mouth. Okay, I'm open to that. But how many times have we seen that in our times? Younger women don't have the worldliness to understand the motivation of a strong male personality. Now, as a woman grows in age and experience, she learns to pick up on all of that. Perhaps here's an example. When I was in high school, I was a high school senior. By the time I got to be a senior, I was pretty popular. I was a musician. I was well known. I ran with a pretty cool crowd. And when the new freshman class came in, there was this really pretty young lady who was a freshman. I won't mention her name. But I purposely focused my attention on her. And we started dating. And of course, she became totally enamored. A senior was paying attention to her, a freshman. And this was a big deal to her and to her friends. A popular senior was paying attention to her. And I ended up hurting her horribly because I wasn't in love with her. I wasn't in love with her. She thought I was. And I just broke it off callously with her right before Christmas that year. Totally crushed her. Absolutely destroyed her. It took years for me to muster up the courage to find her and apologize for my behavior. And we're friends now. She is a wonderful lady. She's a grandmother, a mother and a grandmother, and she's had a good life, and we're friends. But this was an example of someone who was older, who knows better, taking advantage of someone who's younger, who doesn't know better. That's the sense I get when I'm reading the story about David and Bathsheba. I don't think she was bathing naked on a rooftop. I think David was planning this. He stayed home. I think this was the reason that he probably stayed home. For whatever reason, he got into his mind that he had to have this woman. And he's a king. Think about the power dynamics here. Who's going to refuse a summons from the king of Israel? Not a young woman. And she probably thought she could trust David because she'd grown up around the court, right? She'd grown up around David's courtyard. All right, it says here, David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Now, she was purifying herself from a monthly uncleanness. We just talked about that. She went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David saying, I am pregnant. All right. I don't know if this is a one-time thing between her and David or an ongoing thing. Well, her husband was out at battle. But when she sent word to David saying, I'm pregnant, they didn't have the scientific ways that we have today determining pregnancy. I wonder how long she was pregnant before she really knew she was pregnant. She'd never been pregnant before, so she didn't understand some of the changes that certainly would have been going on with her body. So I'm guessing, maybe 2 months in, maybe halfway through her first trimester, things start to show, things start to be a little different and noticeably different. And she sends word to David saying, I'm pregnant. Now, not being told otherwise, the reader would reasonably assume a Torah-observant woman, teenager, from a prominent family, would behave as socially expected, with modesty and humility, with a healthy sense of shame. Bathsheba would hardly have been pursuing David. Again, I got this from this article. Would hardly have been pursuing David. Rather, as a young female, she would have been unsure how to resist the king. The significant power distance between David and Bathsheba likely limited her ability to refuse the superior. Again, she would have been known by David. She probably grew up around David's court. She was a young woman when he became king, a young girl. And then when she becomes of marrying age, between 16 and 19, she's married off to Uriah the Hittite. David knew who she was. She comes from a prominent family. Her grandfather was in his court advising David. Considering the social realities in 1 Samuel 11, it's most plausible that she was not seeking an extramarital relationship with David. Now, the text is quiet on that. I could be totally wrong. She set the trap to go have an affair with the king. I could be wrong. I don't think I am. The more I read this, the more I'm convinced that David played her. When Nathan confronts David later about all this, there is zero mention of any of this being Bathsheba's fault. All fingers point directly and squarely at David. The thing that David did displeased the Lord mightily. So I'm drawing all my conclusions from doing just some kind of reverse engineering of what I'm reading and what I know of human nature. And frankly, what I'm seeing in the church around me today, we see examples of powerful men in the ministry taking advantage of women who are under their ministry. And we see time and again men of God with influence taking advantage of women who don't have the necessary tools to recognize when something wrong is happening. That's what's happening here. David, in his mid-30s, takes advantage of a young woman married to one of his soldiers, one of his mercenaries, while her husband's gone. I kind of think this is very much a planned event by David. Verse 6. So David sent this word to Joab, Send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent him to David. And when Uriah came to him, David asked him how Joab was, how the soldiers were, and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, go down to your house, wash your feet. Well, in other words, go home, be with your wife. So Uriah left the palace, and a gift from the king was sent after him. But Uriah slept at the entrance to the palace with all his master's servants and did not go down to his house. You know, another thought occurred to me, and I wrote it down here. It's not impossible to think that Uriah perhaps knew about David's relationship with Bathsheba. Other people did. There were messengers that took Bathsheba back and forth, that took messages back and forth. There were messengers that she sent to David to tell him that she was pregnant. There were people who knew about Bathsheba and David. David was told Uriah did not go home. So he asked Uriah, haven't you just come from a military campaign? Why didn't you go home? Uriah said to David, the ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and my lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing. He's taking the honorable way out. He's saying, look, I'm not going to do what my men are not allowed to do. That's awesome. But now my conspiracy theorist brain is going on full bore here. Uriah is a mercenary, a hired soldier. He's not Jewish. And he's married to a Jewish woman. What if he knew what had happened between his wife and David? Do you think he was in a position to accuse the king? He had a dance to dance here that would be really, really tricky. The best thing he could do, if I were him, the best thing he could do was to make it a point to not go home, to not sleep with my wife. And if I won't go home and I won't sleep with my wife, then the baby that's coming will definitely be known to be David's and not Uriah's, and David's sin will come out into the public. That's a response that could have been Uriah's. Again, he's in a position. How is he going to accuse the king of Israel, the man after God's own heart? That how would he say to the world that this king that loves God so much slept with my wife? How would he do that? So I'm thinking it's very possible that Uriah knew what was going on. David said to him, stay here one more day, and tomorrow I will send you back. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. At David's invitation, he ate and drank with him, and David made him drunk. But in the evening, Uriah went out to sleep on his mat among his master's servants. He did not go home. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In it, he wrote, put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest, and then withdraw from him, so he will be struck down and die. So his plan to make the baby look like Uriah's failed. The only thing left to do is to get Uriah out of the picture totally. So while Joab had the city under siege, he put Uriah at a place where he knew the strongest defenders were. And when the men of the city came out and fought against Joab, some of the men in David's army fell. Moreover, Uriah the Hittite died. When Joab receives this message from David, he recognizes that to isolate Uriah all by himself and let him be killed would cast suspicion on David's motives. It would look like a murder. So he thus besieges Rabbah, the Ammonite capital, and puts Uriah at a place where its troops are defending it. But he also sends other men in David's army to accompany Uriah into the heat of battle, but they're hopelessly outnumbered, and they're all killed. Joab sacrifices some of his men to cover David's sin. So Joab sent David a full account of the battle. He instructed the messenger, when you have finished giving the king this account of the battle, the king's anger may flare up. And he may ask you, why did you get so close to the city to fight? Didn't you know that they would shoot arrows from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, son of Jerubbesheth? Didn't a woman drop a millstone on him from the wall so he died in Thebez? Why did you get so close to the wall? If he asks you this, then say to him, moreover, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead. So the messenger set out, and when he arrived, he told David everything Joab had sent him to say. The messenger said to David, the men overpowered us and came out against us in the open, but we drove them back to the entrance of the city gate. Then the archers shot arrows at your servants in the wall, and some of the king's men died. Moreover, your servant Uriah the Hittite died. David told the messenger, say this to Joab. This is cold. Don't let this upset you. The sword devours one as well as another. Press the attack against the city and destroy it. Say this to encourage Joab. Now when Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. And at the time of her mourning was over, 7 days, David had her brought to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. All right, this is cold. He arranges to have Uriah the Hittite killed. Murder. Word gets to his wife, your husband's dead. She mourns for 7 days. And immediately after that 7-day mourning period's over, David brings her into the castle, brings her into the palace, makes her his wife. And soon thereafter, a son is born. I'm guessing that son would be 2 months premature. Not really, because she was probably 2 months pregnant when she told David she was pregnant. It was an early delivery, but the boy was healthy. David shed no tears for Uriah the Hittite. With the husband dead, her period of mourning over, 7 days, the way is open for David to bring her to his house. This phrase, he brings her into his house, emphasizes the abuse of royal power that David exercises. She becomes David's wife, and in due course, a son is born of their early adulterous act. Although short-lived and unnamed, the child would not be unloved during the days of his fatal illness. To say that I was disappointed in David upon researching and studying this particular story would be a vast understatement. I have worked with pastors who hurt their families in amazingly hard ways. I was at a church who brought in a pastor from another state. The particular denomination, they would interview potential men to be pastors, and the pastoral search committee found this man, and they loved him, and they brought him in to be pastor. What they didn't know was that he was leaving the church he was at because he'd been caught in an adulterous affair with another woman. But he brought his family and children out to California to this church and became our pastor. And what this church didn't know is that he also paid to bring this other woman and put her up in a house so that and kept the adulterous affair going. The heart of man is deceitfully wicked above all things. When I read this story of David, I don't see an accidental happening. I don't see Bathsheba seducing David. I see David abusing his power as a leader of Israel to get Bathsheba. Eventually, good comes out of this, believe it or not. But this event is vile. And I'm crushed by it. I am crushed by it. So, what's God going to do? Because nothing's done in a vacuum. What is God going to do? We'll read about that tomorrow. Nathan the prophet is going to bring David straight to the feet of God on this. And it's not pretty. I couldn't lead this devotional the way I left it. I shouldn't have. One of the purposes of doing devotional Bible reading is to get a picture of God and to get a clearer picture of yourself. I ask God, what do you want to show me in what I'm reading today about you? What do you want to show me about me? So I'm going to just lay it out there. This is what God showed me today. And I don't know why I skipped over it, because this might be a gut punch to some of you. Young women should be safe in the presence of us older men. We should be a safe haven. We should be protectors. A young woman should not get the sense that an older man is preying on her. David should have been Bathsheba's protector. Instead, he became something way different. As a teacher, as a private music teacher, I've had lots of young ladies walk through my teaching studio, mostly high school and middle school. And if I were to allow my mind for an instant to go in the direction that David's mind went when he saw Bathsheba and pursued her, which I believe he did, the utter destruction that would take place in these young ladies' lives and in my life would be volcanic. I can't imagine being like David. But David's story tells us that it's possible. We need to safeguard our attitude in that regard. Young women should feel safe in our presence. We have an obligation to keep them safe. I suppose I could go on and on and on about that, but I had to say that and get that off my chest. We need to be a safe place, not a place where young women can be hurt and damaged. Well, what did you think about today's devotional? As you can tell, it was an emotional one for me. And especially in light of today's events that we read about happening in the church, this thing really hit home. I would be very much interested in your views on this. Email me at ffog@me.com, or you can respond to this in my Facebook page or my YouTube page. This is important, and I would really love to hear your input on this. Have a great day. Bye-bye.